Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. I'm honored to be here today speaking on the topic of sustainable mobility. Thanks for joining. I actually wanted to start with a simple picture. This is a Toyota Corolla, model year 1974. And it's for the last 48 years that the Toyota Corolla has been the #1 selling vehicle in the world. This year is the first time it will lose that crown. And to who, you may ask? It's actually the Tesla Model Y. A fully electric vehicle is going to take the crown from the Toyota Corolla this year. And I use this as an opening example just to illustrate the amount of disruption that mobility is undergoing for the first time in 50 or even 100 years. And given this is a sustainable mobility topic, I wanted to at least first frame in terms of emissions what mobility and transportation generates in terms of emissions out of the total, right? So there's 8 gigatons of emissions from on-road transportation, shipping, aviation, and rail. Half of that is your passenger vehicle market, 2, 3, 4-wheelers. Another quarter of that is from commercial vehicles and buses, and the remainder from your air shipping and rail. So we wanted to establish that just to give ourselves a framing as to the percent contribution that transport has in overall emissions. And then more importantly, perhaps, to try to make that tangible, if we actually say we want to have a net zero world by 2050, or whatever year that is, what that actually means is the 2 billion vehicles that are on the road around the world need to be zero emission. The 20 trillion plus ton kilometers need to somehow become zero emission. And the 1 billion tons of fuel that we consume every year in shipping, rail, and aviation need to be decarbonized. You may look at those numbers and say, that's near impossible. And I'm not blind to the fact that it's going to be incredibly, incredibly difficult. But nonetheless, if we get even 70 or 80 or 90% of the way there, it represents a dramatic, dramatic change from the world we know it as today. And even beyond climate, there's many reasons in which this new mobility world needs to evolve. If you think about congestion lowering productivity, or accidents that are shortening people's lives, or just the labor shortages of even finding drivers, we need to evolve how we do mobility going forward. General Motors, one company that's an automaker, they have a very simple slogan for the next 10 or 15 years called 0, 0, 0. Zero congestion, zero emissions, zero crashes. And I think that's a very appropriate slogan for actually the entire industry in terms of what they're striving for over these next decades. And so what gives me hope that we can actually do all of this or some of this? And it's really these 5 forces on the slide here, right? It's going to come down to innovation. It's going to come down to behavior change. And regulation is going to be an underlying driver to all of that. But when all of those forces converge, and as they are now and being unlocked like never before, that's where the opportunity is really, really generated. And so let's imagine for a second what that needs to look like. Is in city centers, we need to reimagine how we move and live about the world, right? We can't just have a one-to-one substitution of a petrol-based vehicle turning into an electric vehicle, or for every individual that rises to middle income status or higher income status buying a car. That can't be the future going forward if we hope to meet our net zero journey. But nonetheless, there's some really attractive innovations that are coming to market. Several of these of which you can observe in Colombia, right? So the recapturing of public space, of roads for public use, as we see the bike routes here. That was largely driven in many other cities based on the pandemic and trying to bring back the use of roads for other purposes. You and I might debate if and when we'll ever see a robo-taxi, 2030, 2040, maybe later. Nonetheless, a child born today is probably not going to ever have a driver's license, which is just a fundamental rechanging of how we think about how cities are used. And it's not just city centers. You can actually extrapolate that to farms, ports, other places, where they'll have some of the same reinventions that are required. And this may only be an illustration, but this is a self-sufficient site that incorporates hydrogen, renewable power, green transport, all into something that is, again, self-sufficient, could even be a net export energy exporter. And it's a real concept. This may be an illustration, but there are ecosystems like a mining project in Africa that are working to build exactly this today. And so what does this new world really entail then, right? It is a world that's going to be much more connected, autonomous, shared, electric, and circular. And if I'm looking for opportunities, no matter who I am, I can stare at this page and hopefully find some. If I'm a miner or a recycler or a grower, I look at this and say, just imagine the amount of critical minerals that are going to need to be mined, or bio-based feedstocks that are going to need to be grown to deliver on some of these challenges. If I'm a utility, I look at the number of 800 terawatt hours of green electricity that need to be produced by 2030 to power our vehicles in a clean manner. What an opportunity. Or if I'm a disruptive startup, a company we don't even know of yet today, I probably look at this and say, I have a technology for that, or I have a business model that I can reinvent. And so next, I wanted to just do a quick deep dive on some of the different types of transportation and where we see that evolving. First, starting with passenger vehicles. The three main forces for passenger vehicle electrification are regulations, the improving cost of batteries, and then just automakers now bringing an entire portfolio of solutions to the market. So we're now seeing electric two-wheelers, electric cars, electric pickup trucks. And some of the vehicles that are being brought to market are better than anything we've ever seen before on the internal combustion side. Regulations in Europe, some of the first internal combustion bans start in 2025 in Scandinavia or in Greater London. On the battery cost side, they have risen for the first time this year than ever before because of supply and demand issues. But nonetheless, battery costs have come down fivefold over the past decade, and they're set to come down another half in the decade ahead. And we don't even need that much progress for an electric vehicle to have purchase price parity with a petrol-based vehicle, and especially on a total cost of ownership standpoint. And so this is what gives us confidence that as we think about what does the forecast look like for next 5, 10, 15 years, we can actually see a pretty impressive jump. And it's our belief that by 2030, 50% of all of the vehicles sold in the largest three markets, China, Europe, and the United States, will not have a diesel or gasoline tank in them. And by 2035, 2/3 of all vehicles sold in those markets will not have a diesel or gasoline tank in them. Europe's driving the pace, and that's largely because of regulations, again, setting up a 2035 limit for when internal combustion engines can no longer be sold. But nonetheless, China's showing tremendous uptake today too, especially in the largest cities. So the Beijings, the Shanghais are moving at a pace even faster than where Europe's at. And it's really the tier 2 or tier 3 cities in China that don't have as strong of a grid infrastructure where they're going to rely on more hybrid solutions for longer. And this might be a forecast, but even if we just look very quickly at what's happened in the past year, we don't need to project too far just to see how far things have already come. And I can point you to China on the left-hand side in particular, where year over year, just to the first half of this year versus the first half of last year, doubled in the number of electric vehicles put on the road. And now, 1 out of every 5 vehicles sold in the world's largest auto market is fully electric. That's impressive. Europe might look a little bit flatter year over year, but it doubled the prior year. And the United States, also looking relatively small at this stage of the game, but I think it's prime for a real jump here after we start to see some of the supply constraints alleviate. And so then let's think, not only do we believe it's already happening, but how fast can it actually go? Like what's giving us confidence that you can look at historical reasons and therefore project into the future? And Norway's always led in that adoption. And for a variety of reasons, largely political or regulatory, but nonetheless, you can use them as the first barometer. They're already above 75% of all new vehicles sold in the market today that are electric. And it took them 10 years to get there, from 1%, when they hit that 1% mark of EV adoption, to then springing forward to 75%. But I'd really have you focus on that 5% EV adoption number, the second column, because that's what we typically look at when we say the tipping point. After that point is where you start to see S-curve adoption and it really accelerates. And in the case of Norway and China, it took 3 years to go from 5% adoption to 25% adoption. It's happened even faster in Germany, 18 months. We don't know where the US is at. They're not going to catch Germany's speed, but they might still stay pace with China. I put India two-wheelers on here because they might be at a small percentage today, only 1%, but the things they're doing in that country to innovate on the business side, on the regulatory side, they have an ambition for all new vehicles to be 25%, all two-wheelers to be 25% of total two-wheelers sold by 2025, so just in a few years' time. And with Colombia's market of, I believe, 9 million two-wheelers on the road today, it's an important measuring stick in terms of how fast this country can go as well. And then finally, I put Colombia in terms of four-wheelers on the page, only at 1% today, or as of last year, and the story is still to be written. But you can look at these and say, what's similar, what's different from the rest of the market in terms of how fast we can move. And I had meant to mention on the prior page that, again, this is all new vehicle sales. It takes a long, long time to work its way into the overall car population. So even if the US is going to be 50% sales in 2030, we're still talking about 10, maybe 15% of the 300 million vehicles on the road in the US that are actually electric. A significant portion will continue to use what we've always known will consume oil, will consume gas for years to come. So that was more of the passenger vehicle story. If we then quickly kind of bounce to the next one of commercial vehicles, I think they're about 5 years behind where the passenger vehicle market is. And there's some nuanced differences here that you may notice. First being, there's a role for natural gas here in some of the world's largest markets. This is a US picture. But natural gas has a bigger play in commercial vehicles than it does in passenger vehicles. Again, Colombia knows natural gas for even passenger vehicles, as does India and other places. The second important nuance is it's important to take a segmented view because not every truck is used in exactly the same way. You have medium or heavy-duty trucks. You have heavy-duty trucks that might be used in short haul and therefore be very appropriate for a battery to serve that needs versus a long-haul application where long range, faster refueling time is needed, and that's going to be better suited for something like a fuel cell long term. So disaggregating that and therefore seeing something like the fourth column here for long haul, that's where you see both slower adoption because it's just a lot harder to get there, and then second, you see a greater percentage relative to batteries of fuel cell adoption. And then the third piece to call out is buses. Right? Buses, we believe, of the commercial vehicle fleet will move fastest. And as I was doing a little bit of research for this, I was interested to learn that Bogota here will actually, as of next year, have the second largest electric bus fleet in the world outside of China. Not to say that you won't have a lot of other buses that will still continue to be other uses, but the world's second largest fleet of electric vehicles is in this city. That's amazing. On the marine side, this is where it gets even harder than commercial vehicles, and aviation will be the same story that I'll get to in a second. We call these the hardest to abate transport sectors. And yes, there might be 10 to 20% of emissions that you can look at and say we can alleviate through operational efficiencies. But the remaining 50, 80%, which requires hydrogen, biofuels, ammonia, just doesn't justify the investment today, or the economics aren't there. And that red line I put, because that's actually the offset carbon price in Europe today. So anything above that line, you'd rather just buy an offset than you would be to invest in some of these solutions, which just poses a real large challenge for what is the shipping sector going to do to be able to reach its net zero goals long term. And it comes down to innovation, it comes down to scale, it comes down to partnerships. The same is true for aviation. Just a few months ago, this plane out of Sweden was the first plane to fly 100% sustainable aviation fuels. So we've seen it happen now. Nonetheless, the challenges to sustainable aviation fuels is no different than what you'll see in shipping in terms of e-ammonia or e-methanol. And then you layer on top of that the cost, which is today 2 to 10 times larger than jet fuel. That needs to come down through investment in pilots and continued activity. But then to even create those synthetic fuels, you need a tremendous amount of land for the feedstock to be able to grow those biofuels. You need a tremendous amount of infrastructure in place to be able to create the green hydrogen. So we're talking about a full-on, again, ecosystem type of investment that's required for aviation to have a chance at working towards the decarbonization goal. And it's not in the 2030 timeframe. It's still more in a 2050 or even 2060 timeframe, but the investments have to start now to get that flywheel going. And so then quickly wanted to run through, recognizing change is never easy. And there's just, you can continue to point to areas where there's challenges, whether it be resource scarcity, infrastructure issues, the regulatory frameworks not being in place. And I'll get through these rather briefly, but again, I would ask you to look at these not for the challenges that they are, to therefore say that sustainable mobility will not happen at all, but to actually say, how can I be part of creating the opportunity to change and reshape this world? And scarcity is a huge one that's hit in the battery market this year, but it actually shows up in a number of other places too, whether we're talking about carbon credits, we're talking about recycled content, other things. We just need to bring on the battery materials a lot faster than they have been. Demand is taking off, but the mining operations or the equipment manufacturers that are the equipment that goes into the cell manufacturing facilities that then can build these batteries, they take a lot longer to ramp up. And so breaking through in terms of where these bottlenecks can be relieved is just incredibly important to continuing on our journey. And supply chains they're not just scarce, but they're actually quite localized and creating opportunities for where we're not resilient. Again, using battery materials as an example, is China produces 70% of the world's battery cells. It has more than 70% of the processing capacity and the battery components that go into those cells. And so it's incredibly concentrated. And not only is that good in general, but not good in general from a resiliency standpoint, you then have geopolitical issues like the US and China decoupling that creates stability challenges here. And perhaps most importantly, you have a number of countries that are looking at this clean transition and saying, we want this as an opportunity to be an economic growth engine for us as well. And so it's the extractive countries like Australia or Indonesia or many countries here in South America that look at this and say, well, we want to capture more of the value chain. Or it's those that are large players on the demand side like India or Europe that say, we want to localize supply chains and create jobs in our regions as well. So there's just a whole lot of supply chain reevaluation that will have to occur in the years ahead. Infrastructure is another major one, right? Even if we do get all of these electric vehicles on the road, if we do manage to have fuel cells, renewable get natural gas, other aspects, it would be a shame if the electric grid and or our fueling infrastructure couldn't keep up and puts at risk the speed of adoption. And the right-hand side picture is just one example. It's near Los Angeles Airport in the United States. And the red lines are indicative of sites that are going to require more than 5 years of wait time before the utility can actually upgrade that infrastructure and create enough electrical hosting capacity to be able to put a charger on site, which just isn't acceptable for drivers that are looking to buy electric vehicles and have plenty of opportunities to figure out where they can charge. And then finally, in terms of some of the challenges to highlight, is regulators have a clear role here. Yes, absolutely, in terms of grants, incentives, other programs to try to spur this along, or to think about climate or tax policies. But even things as simple as, or not as simple, but thinking about autonomous vehicles and how they come in. There's tons of questions around who owns the data, safety, liability, that you need to have regulators at the table helping make those decisions, draw up those frameworks to allow these new innovations to really thrive. And so final parting thoughts, just in terms of, for anyone looking to participate in this sustainable mobility transition, I would encourage 5 things. One is rigorously focus. We hear too many examples of companies trying to be something for everyone and not having a distinct value proposition that's focused and that can be a part of a winning playbook. The second is challenge everything. The reason Tesla's in such a powerful position as they are today is they actually said, what if we thought about a car as a computer on wheels? Where does that put us in terms of how we design, build, manufacture? And therefore, can we create long-term competitive advantage from that? The third is scale is going to be incredibly important. Always has been, will continue to be. You have to be able to generate enough cash to fund the journey. You have to be able to be large enough to be able to get access to those scarce resources. Scale really matters. Data is a part of almost everything when we think about all those new mobility opportunities. And so without being able to master data, you really have a little chance of being able to be successful in those opportunities. And then the final one is winning with talent. So the skills that are needed for tomorrow are not the same ones that got us to where we are today. And so it's about cultivating internally your best talent. It's about aggressively recruiting in different pools than you have looked for before. And it's partnerships to be able to close the gaps. All that to say, the task before us is immense. But if we do all the things mentioned previously, when we get this right, I truly believe we can change the world to something that is safer, more equitable, cleaner, and an economic engine of growth for the future and for decades to come. Thanks.